The gate creaks the same way it has creaked every Friday for 4 years, and Kioma reaches for the latch before the delivery boy finishes parking his bicycle. The bouquet is white lilies this week, wrapped in brown paper, tied with the same green ribbon it is always tied with. She takes it the way she always takes it, both hands. Careful at the stems, a card is tucked into the ribbon, small, cream-colored, and she slides it out before she even smells the flowers. That is her ritual within the ritual. Read first, smell after. Her thumb finds the fold the way it has found it 200 times before. But this Friday, for reasons she cannot name, her thumb pauses on the paper. Something about the fold is different, tighter, as if closed in a hurry, by hands thinking of something else entirely. She does not know why this troubles her, she only knows that it does. This is the story of Kioma house on Adeniran Close smelled, most mornings, of frying plantain, and the faint sweetness of the lilies that never quite finished drying before the next batch arrived. Kioma kept the old ones in a tall glass vase on the dining table until Thursday night, when she would take them down, press 2 or 3 petals into the notebook she kept in the drawer beneath her side of the bed, and make room for whatever Kelechi sent next. She was 34. She rose before the generator hum of the neighborhood had fully quieted from the night before the first Okada engines coughed to life on the main road, and she moved through the house in the gray light with a kind of economy that had nothing performative in it. She was not doing it for anyone to see. That was the thing about Chioma. People who knew her said it without being able to explain exactly what they meant. She does things quietly, they would say, and then struggle to say more, because the quietness itself was the whole of it. She ironed Kelechi's shirts with the iron her mother had given her at the wedding, the fabric hissing under steam, the smell of hot cotton filling the small back room. She did not wait to be thanked. She had stopped expecting to be, not out of bitterness, but because somewhere along the way she had decided that a house did not run on gratitude. It ran on hands that kept moving. Her mother, Beatrice, visited most Sunday afternoons, arriving with a wrapper of roasted groundnuts and a way of looking at things that saw more than she ever said aloud. Beatrice had buried a husband, young, and raised 3 children on a seamstress's income, and if there was one thing she had learned in that life, it was when to hold her tongue. She would sit on the veranda with Kioma, shelling the groundnuts into a bowl between them, and she would watch her daughter's face the way a woman watches weather. Once, only once, she had said, almost to herself, a woman does not need to ask why the rain is falling. She only needs to know whether to bring in the washing. Kioma had laughed at the time. She did not understand yet that her mother was not talking about rain. The marriage, from the outside, looked like something other women envied, without saying so directly. Kelechi worked in logistics, drove a car that did not rattle, and had 4 years ago begun the tradition that made Kioma's name known on their street, the Friday Flowers. Neighbors who did not know her well knew her as the woman whose husband still sent bouquets after a decade of marriage. Aunties at church functions asked her, half joking, half hungry for the secret, what she had done to deserve a man like that. Kioma never had a good answer. She only knew that every Friday, without fail, the flowers came, and she had built, quietly, an entire private mythology around what that meant. What she did not tell anyone, not her mother, not her closest friend Uju, not even herself in so many words, was that she had begun, almost by accident, to notice the flowers themselves. The ways the stems were cut, the way certain arrangements leaned into asymmetries on purpose, a kind of controlled wildness that pleased something in her she had not known was hungry. She started keeping a second notebook, separate from the one with the pressed petals, where she sketched the shapes of the bouquets after she had rearranged them in her own vases. She did not call it a hobby. She did not call it anything. It was simply something her hands did, while the rest of her life moved forward on its usual, well-worn track. Kelechi was not a cruel man in any way the neighbors would have recognized. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. His cruelty, when it eventually revealed itself, would be cruelty of a different order entirely. The cruelty of routine, of a system built so carefully that it had stopped feeling, even to him, like a lie. There was an evening, early in the second year of the flowers, when Kioma had asked him, lightly, almost as a joke, why lilies so often? He had looked up from his phone with an expression that lasted only a second. Not guilt exactly, something closer to the flicker of a man recalculating. Before he said, because you deserve something that lasts a little longer than the week, and went back to his phone. She had thought it was romantic. She had told Uju about it the next day, glowing. Uju was the friend who represented the road Kioma never took. Loud where Kioma was quiet, quick to anger where Kioma absorbed things and kept moving. Uju had been divorced twice by 30, not from bad luck, but from refusing, each time. To sit still inside anything that did not feel right. Leave before you're comfortable, she's like to say. Comfort is how they keep you. She said things like this over pepper soup on Saturday afternoons, gesturing with her spoon, and Kioma would nod and smile and privately think that her own life, her steady life, her Friday flower life, was proof that patience and quiet devotion built something Uju's fire never could. It was around this time that Kioma began arranging flowers for other people, almost without meaning to start a thing. A neighbor's daughter was getting engaged and could not afford the florist prices quoted for the introduction ceremony. Kioma, unasked, spent a Thursday night with wire and ribbon and the extra stems she had saved from her own bouquets, and produced 6 centerpieces that made the aunties at the ceremony stop mid-sentence. Word moved the way. Word moves on a close, quiet street, not loudly, but completely. Within a month, she had done flowers for 2 more events, taking no payment beyond transport money, because she had not yet let herself believe this was something she was allowed to want. She began, in the margins of her days, teaching herself properly. She found a woman 2 streets over who sold flowers wholesale and would let her sit for an hour on slow afternoons, watching how the woman's hands moved, asking small questions that she stored away like coins. She saved what little she could, not money exactly, at first, just cuttings, ribbon ends. An old pair of Florist shears bought second hand at Yaba Market and wrapped in cloth so Kelechi would not ask what they were for. She kept them in a biscuit tin at the back of the wardrobe, beneath a stack of old wrappers, and she added to it the way she added petals to her notebook. Quietly, without asking anyone's permission, her mother-in-law, who lived 2 bus stops away and visited on the first Saturday of every month, was the kind of woman who noticed everything and confronted nothing. She would sit in Kioma's parlor, eat whatever was placed in front of her, and offer comments that seemed to drift sideways from the actual thing she meant. Once, watching Kioma trim a bouquet at the dining table, she said, almost absently, "Your hands know something your mouth has never said." Kioma laughed it off as a compliment about her flower arranging. It would be a long time before she understood that Kelechi's mother had meant something else entirely, that the older woman had seen something in her son's face on certain evenings and chosen, as she chose about most difficult things, to say nothing more. Peace kept in that house was never really peace. It was only a debt, quietly accumulating, waiting for a date to be called due. The anniversary was 11 days away, and Kioma had been planning the order for weeks. Not the Friday bouquet this time, but something larger, something she wanted to commission herself, as a gift back to the marriage that had given her, however she understood it then, 4 years of unbroken devotion. She wanted an arrangement worthy of the flowers that had shaped her own hands. She wanted, she realized only later, to walk into that florist's shop and finally see with her own eyes the place where all of it began. The shop sat on a familiar street she had passed 100 times without stopping. A narrow storefront with buckets of gladioli lined up outside, and the cool, wet smell of stems freshly cut. The man behind the counter was older, unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades around things that bloom and die on a predictable schedule. His name was Mr. Adeyemi, and he greeted her warmly the way he greeted most of his regular customers' families, and asked, while flipping through his order book to find her husband's account, whether she wanted the same card as last week. Since your husband usually writes two different messages. Kioma's feet stopped moving. She did not answer right away. Mr. Adeyemi, still unaware that anything had shifted in the room, kept talking, the way people do when silence has not yet told them to stop, mentioning, casually, that Mr. Kelechi was one of his most loyal customers. 4 years running, Fridays without fail, always 2 bouquets, always careful about which card went with which. He said it the way a man recites a fact he has recited many times, proud in the small professional way of someone confirming a satisfied client. He had no idea what he was holding. That was the whole of it. If he had known, it would have been a different kind of morning. He did not know, and so he simply kept speaking, and every word landed on Kioma like something falling from a height she had not known she was standing beneath. She asked, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, for the order record, every entry, every card, every message if he kept them. Mr. Ademi, seeing something now in her face that made him quiet down at last, went to the back room without a single further question and returned with a thin ledger and a folder of carbon copies. He had no reason to withhold it. He gave it to her the way he would give a receipt. She stood at that counter and read 4 years of her marriage from the other side. 2 names, 2 addresses, 2 sets of Friday deliveries. Written in Kelechi's own handwriting on the order slips he filled out himself each week, 1 card that said things she recognized, tender and familiar, and 1 card that said things that were tender in an entirely different register, addressed to a name she had never heard in her own house. She checked the dates 3 times before she let herself believe them. She checked the handwriting 3 times more. That evening, she went home and confronted him with the folder still in her bag, unopened in front of him, and simply asked him to explain the second address. Kelechi's face did the thing faces do when a system built over years suddenly meets daylight. A brief involuntary slackness quickly gathered back into composure. He said it was complicated. He said it did not mean what she thought. he said eventually, with something that sounded almost like irritation at having to explain himself at all, that she had never asked. Had she, in 4 years, ever once asked where the flowers came from, as if her trust were the failure, and not his 4 years of careful unbroken deception. His mother, present that evening for her usual Saturday visit that had fallen a day early, sat through the entire exchange with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. Her silence was not neutral, it never had been. It was the sound of a woman who had suspected for a long time and decided each time that peace was worth more than truth. Kioma understood, watching her mother-in-law's still face, exactly what kind of peace that had been. By the following week, the story had already changed shape in the mouths of the neighbors, softened here, sharpened there, some insisting Kioma must have known and stayed for the comfort, others insisting she must have driven him to it. Only Uju believed her without conditions, arriving the next morning with a flask of tea and no questions, sitting with her the way people sit with the newly grieving, offering nothing but her presence. That was all Kioma got. It was, in the end, enough to stand on. That night she sat alone in the room that still smelled faintly of lilies, the biscuit tin open on her lap, the shears inside it catching the single bulb's light. She did not cry. She had expected to and found, instead, a stillness she did not recognize, heavy and complete. Like water after a stone has already sunk to the bottom. She thought of the 4 years of Fridays, the cards she had pressed into her notebook, believing they were the whole truth, and understood now that she had been reading only half a story and calling it a marriage. She made herself one promise in the dark, quietly, the way people make the promises that actually hold, that whatever came next, she would build it with her own 2 hands, and she would never again mistake a gift for proof of anything. Tomorrow, she would begin again from nothing. She left on a Tuesday with 1 suitcase, the biscuit tin, and the notebook of pressed petals, which she almost left behind, and then, at the door, turned back for. Kelechi's mother watched her go from the veranda, arms folded, face unreadable except for the eyes, which held the particular sorrow of someone who had known something for a long time and chosen silence over it, and who understood now that silence had not protected anyone after all. The first months were smaller than anything Kioma had known since she was a girl in her mother's 1-room flat. She rented a single room off a compound in Yaba, shared a bathroom with 4 other tenants, and took on whatever work her hands could find: sewing repairs, hair braiding, the odd cleaning job for a woman 2 streets over. She did not complain to anyone who had not already earned the right to hear it. Her earnings barely covered rent and food, and some weeks did not cover both. Some evenings she counted her earnings twice, not because the arithmetic ever changed, but because counting was something to do with her hands besides missing the life she had left. She learned the compound's rhythms the way she had once learned Kelechi's. The neighbor who fried akara at 5, the tenant whose radio never turned off before midnight, the shared tap that ran weak on Tuesdays. She did not complain about any of it to anyone who had not already earned the right to hear it, which in those months meant only Uju, who came by on Sundays with tea in a flask and never once said "I told you so," though she would have been entitled to. It was Mrs. Folashade Bello, a wedding planner who had hired her once, years earlier, for a rushed centerpiece job through a mutual contact, who found her again by accident at a friend's introduction ceremony where Kioma had volunteered to help with the flowers in exchange for a plate of food. Folashade watched her work for 20 minutes without saying a word, watched the way she chose stems, the deliberate imperfection she built into every arrangement, and finally asked the question that would open the first door. Who taught you to do this? Kioma told her the truth. No one, only watching, only practicing, only the tin of shears bought second-hand at Yaba Market. Folashade did not hire her that day. She simply took her number and said, "When I have something worth your time, I will call." She was too busy building to notice, at first, the way old acquaintances spoke of her now. She overheard once, at a market stall, two women from her former street discussing her. One saying it was a shame, the other saying, in a tone edged with something less kind than sympathy, that perhaps a woman who spent so much time on flowers should have spent more time on her husband. Kioma did not turn around. She paid for her tomatoes and walked on, the words settling into her the way rain settles into ground that has already decided to hold firm. There were nights the loneliness sat with her, the way a stray cat sits at a doorway, uninvited but not unwelcome either, and she let it stay rather than pretend it away. She did not call anyone on those nights. She sorted stems instead, cutting each one at an angle by lamplight until her hands were tired enough to let her sleep. It was not healing exactly. It was closer to maintenance. The daily, unglamorous work of a woman keeping herself upright. Keleki's own life, in those same months, was beginning its own quiet unraveling in a direction Kioma would not learn about until much later. The second household, once hidden, now demanding to be acknowledged in full, expensive and unsustainable, built on a salary that had never actually stretched to cover two women's worth of devotion. But Kioma did not know this yet. She was not thinking of him at all most days. She was thinking of stem lengths and wire gauges and the small biscuit tin that was, slowly, no longer just biscuit tin sized. Folashade called 8 months later with an offer that changed the shape of Kioma's year. A full wedding, 300 guests, a client with real money and exacting taste, and full creative control over the floral design. Kioma took the job with 3 days' notice and no assistant, sourcing stems herself before dawn at the flower market, working through 2 nights on wire frames in her small room until her fingers cramped, and the smell of cut stems seemed to follow her even in sleep. The wedding succeeded beyond anything either of them had projected. Guests photographed the centerpieces before the food arrived. The bride's mother asked, at the reception, for the name of the florist, and Folashade gave it freely. Kioma. Word moved the way it always moves on a crowded, watching city, not because Kioma asked it to, but because it had somewhere true to land. She marked the moment privately, alone in her room that night, allowing herself exactly one long breath and a look at the tin, now heavier than it had ever been. Then she returned to the sketches for the next booking, because there was already a next booking. The bookings kept coming after that, quietly at first, and then in a steadier rhythm, a christening here, an owambe there, a corporate launch that paid more in a single afternoon than 3 months of hair braiding once had. She reinvested almost everything, buying a proper cold box before she bought herself new shoes, and told no one how close the margin still ran, because that was not anyone else's business. 3 years is a long time to build something with your own hands and no one watching. By the end of it, her name, now simply Kioma Blooms, printed modestly on cards she designed herself. carried a different weight on the same streets where women had once whispered about her over tomatoes. She had two girls working under her now, both taught the way she had once taught herself, watching, practicing, asking small questions, and storing the answers away like coins. Fola Shade, present at the opening of Kioma's first proper studio, a converted shopfront with its own cold room and gladioli lined up outside the door, stood back and watched her the way a person watches something they helped plant finally reach the light. Kelechi's collapse did not arrive as a single event. It arrived the way most collapses do, in a slow accumulation of unpaid things, a second household that had never been built on anything but appearances, a salary stretched thinner each month, a woman on the other side of 4 years of Friday Flowers who eventually asked the same questions Kioma had once failed to ask, and did not accept the same silence he had offered his wife. What he had taken had never held without discipline, and discipline had never been the thing he built the system on. Opportunity without preparation is a heavy thing to carry, and he had been carrying it unknowingly for longer than he understood. The car went first, then the flat, then, eventually, the job itself, in a round of restructuring that left him with a title, but no salary attached to it worth mentioning. His mother, visiting less often now, watched her son's rooms grow smaller with each visit and said nothing, the way she had always said nothing. Though this time the silence sat differently on her, Kioma did not know any of this yet. She was too busy working, too busy standing in her own cold room at 5 in the morning sorting stems, to notice the shape of a life collapsing 3 neighborhoods away. He came to her, in the end, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, standing in the doorway of Kioma Blooms with a hesitancy that did not suit the man she remembered. He wore a shirt she recognized, ironed carelessly, a small stain near the collar that the man she had married would never have allowed out of the house. The 2 assistants working the counter quietly found reasons to be in the back room, sensing something in the air before either Kioma or Kelechi had said a single word. Kioma did not move toward him. She did not move away either. She kept arranging the stems in front of her, unhurried, the way she arranged everything now, trimming an inch off a rose stem, turning it, studying the angle of the cut. Kelechi looked around the shop, the cold room, humming quietly behind the counter, the framed photograph of the wedding that had made her name, the small biscuit tin, still in use, sitting on a shelf behind the counter like something sacred, and something moved across his face that was not quite guilt. It was closer to the particular arithmetic of a man realizing, all at once, the size of the wrong answer he had built his whole life around. "You've done well for yourself," he said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to. Kioma did not answer that. She reached for another stem. He asked for help, then, the words arriving carefully, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed something and still cannot make it sound easy. "Not much," he said, "just enough to get through the month." He said it quietly. The old confidence gone from his voice entirely, replaced by something that had never once, in 10 years of marriage, been directed at her, need. Kioma set down the stem she was trimming. "I am not going to help you," she said, "not because I cannot, but because I have already given you everything I had to give, and you spent 4 years proving you did not want it honestly." He started to say something, that it had not been like that, that she was remembering it wrong, the same small deflections he had always reached for. But she raised one hand, not sharply, just enough, and he stopped. What was done to me was wrong, she said. You know it. I know it. There is no version of this conversation where that changes. That chapter is closed, she said, and there was no anger in it, only the flat finality of a door, already shut some time ago, only now being acknowledged out loud. He was quiet for a long moment, looking not at her, but at the tin on the shelf, as if only now understanding what it had become. I'm sorry, he said finally, and it sounded like he meant it, which made it worse somehow, not better. 4 years of Fridays, and it had taken him this long to say 2 words that cost him nothing now and would have cost him everything then. She walked to the door and opened it, not in anger, simply in the plain motion of a woman with somewhere else to be. The afternoon light came in through the doorway, catching the buckets of gladioli lined up outside, and for a moment neither of them moved. He left with one look back, at the shop, at her, at the tin on the shelf catching the light, and did not come again. Kioma closed the door behind him, turned the sign from open to a resting angle it had never quite hung at before, and went back to the rose in her hand as though nothing at all had happened. Because, in the way that mattered most, nothing had. That evening, alone in the studio after the assistants had gone, Kioma stood among the buckets of stems with no anger left in her, no tears, not even the relief she might once have expected. What she felt instead was the deep, settled stillness of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side knowing exactly who she was. She picked up her shears, the same ones from the tin, worn smooth now at the handles, and returned to the arrangement she had left unfinished. She trimmed the stem at an angle, set it into the vase, and stepped back to look at what her own hands had made. She continued the way she always had, the way she always would. If you followed this story to the very end, I truly appreciate you. Please subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. And before you go, there is another beautiful story on your screen right now. Go ahead and watch. I promise it is worth your time.